January 14, 1944. 22,000 feet over northern France. The winter sky is thin, cold, and impossibly blue. Below, a layer of white cloud stretches like a frozen sea. Through it, silver shapes emerge, massive barrel-bodied fighters climbing in formation. Their radial engines thunder, exhaust trails twisting into the high air. From above, two German FW-190s roll in to intercept. Their pilots, confident, dive to meet what they call the flying brick. They've seen this American brute before, huge, heavy, too slow, too clumsy to dogfight. But as the Focke-Wulfs dive and pull to climb again, something unexpected happens. The brick doesn't fall away. It rises, steadily, relentlessly, its prop biting the thin air with a deep mechanical growl. The Germans pull harder, straining to hold altitude. Yet the American machine keeps coming, climbing through their wake, its 8 guns glinting in the sunlight. The mockery fades into alarm. The flying brick is climbing past them. It was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, an aircraft once ridiculed by friend and foe alike. But on that cold morning, its reputation was about to change forever. When the Second World War erupted across Europe, air combat was still defined by agility and elegance. Pilots valued slender airframes, tight turning circles, and liquid-cooled engines that promised speed through finesse. The Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Supermarine Spitfire embodied that philosophy, narrow, sharp, and deadly. But across the Atlantic, in the factories of Republic Aviation in Farmingdale, New York, engineers were building something that defied every convention. It was not sleek. It was not light, and it certainly did not look fast. It was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a flying tank disguised as a fighter. In 1941, when the prototype XP-47B first took to the skies, even its designers were uneasy about its sheer size. At over 7 tons fully loaded, it was nearly twice the weight of the nimble Spitfire. Beneath its rounded fuselage sat the massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp engine, an 18-cylinder, air-cooled monster capable of delivering more than 2,000 horsepower. Behind it ran a labyrinth of ductwork, cooling lines, and a complex turbo-supercharger system mounted in the rear fuselage. This intricate mechanism was designed to give the Thunderbolt extraordinary power at high altitude, but it also made the aircraft look absurdly bulky. American pilots nicknamed it Jug, or Juggernaut, a nod both to its shape and its raw strength. German pilots, after first encountering it in 1943, derisively called it Der Milchflasche, the milk bottle, for its round profile and barrel-like body. To many, it was a joke, a flying brick that had no place in the knife-fight world of aerial combat. The early variants seemed to confirm that view. Initial climb performance was underwhelming, particularly below 10,000 feet, and its acceleration was slow. In dogfights, Luftwaffe pilots could easily outturn it with their Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs or Focke-Wulf FW-190As. Even American pilots struggled to appreciate the machine's potential, calling it heavy, stubborn, and slow to respond. But what most failed to realize was that the P-47 had been designed for a different kind of war, a war fought not in twisting low-level duels, but at high altitude, where bombers flew and where power mattered more than grace. Its engineers had built it to climb into the stratosphere, escort heavy bombers deep into enemy territory, and return pilots alive. The P-47 could take punishment that would tear lighter planes apart. Its thick armor plates and self-sealing fuel tanks gave it an unmatched ability to absorb damage and keep flying. In time, these strengths would prove decisive, but in the early days of 1943, none of that mattered. All anyone saw was a fighter that didn't look like a fighter. When the U.S. Army Air Forces deployed the first Thunderbolts to England in early 1943, skepticism was rampant. The 4th Fighter Group, veterans of the Eagle squadrons who had flown sleek Spitfires with the RAF, received the first P-47Cs with dismay. They found the cockpit cramped, the range limited, and the climb rate disappointing. Worse, the Thunderbolt's complex turbo system required careful management. Early missions saw pilots struggling with power fluctuations and unreliable radios. To make matters worse, its short combat radius, barely 200 miles at first, meant it could only accompany bombers partway into occupied Europe. German fighters simply waited until the Thunderbolts turned home before striking the unescorted bombers. The Luftwaffe's confidence grew as they realized this new American machine, for all its size and noise, couldn't reach them over the heart of Germany. Air superiority remained a German domain through much of 1943. Yet beneath the surface, quiet changes were already underway. Republic engineers in New York and field units in England were studying performance data obsessively. They knew that the Thunderbolt's weaknesses were not permanent, they were mechanical, not fundamental. Back at Farmingdale, engineers worked to refine the propeller design, addressing the plane's biggest flaw: its ability to convert engine power into climb rate. The standard narrow-blade propeller simply couldn't harness the brute force of the R-2800 engine efficiently, especially at altitude. Republic's test pilots noted that with full throttle, the plane felt like it wanted to lift the entire sky, but the prop couldn't bite hard enough to translate that power into vertical motion. The solution would come soon, and it would transform the Thunderbolt's reputation completely. For now, though in the skies over northern France in mid-1943, the Jug was still mocked and doubted. Luftwaffe radio chatter laughed at its size. American mechanics called it a mechanic's nightmare, and pilots, climbing heavily through the clouds, wondered if they were flying the right machine for the job. Yet within months, a new blade shape, a few gallons of water, and a refined engine tune would turn this heavy, lumbering aircraft into one of the most feared climbing machines of the war. The transformation of the Thunderbolt was about to begin, not through redesign, but through evolution under fire. By the autumn of 1943, the Republic engineers and U.S. Army Air Forces mechanics had identified the Thunderbolt's chief limitation. Its climb rate lagged behind the German fighters it faced. At high altitude, its turbocharged R-2800 engine gave immense power, but the original narrow-blade propeller couldn't fully convert that power into thrust. The massive engine was trying to move a mountain of air through blades too thin for the job. When new paddle blade propellers, broader and more efficient, arrived from Hamilton Standard and Curtiss Electric, the effect was immediate and dramatic. The modified P-47s could now harness their full 2,300 horsepower output. Pilots returning from test flights described the change as if the airplane had been reborn. The climb rate leapt by hundreds of feet per minute, and acceleration through vertical maneuvers improved sharply. At the same time, engineers introduced another breakthrough: water injection. The new system allowed a short burst of increased manifold pressure by cooling the air-fuel mixture entering the cylinders. When engaged, the water-methanol mixture gave the R-2800 engine a temporary power boost of nearly 15%, critical during combat climbs and evasive maneuvers. Together, the paddle blade propeller and water injection transformed the P-47's reputation from sluggish to formidable. Late-model P-47 D-22 and D-23 Thunderbolts equipped with these upgrades suddenly became capable of outclimbing most German interceptors above 25,000 feet. In the skies over occupied Europe, this technological leap coincided with a shifting air war. The U.S. 8th Air Force was escalating its daylight bombing campaign over the Reich, sending hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into German territory. The Thunderbolt's range was still limited, but the introduction of drop tanks extended its operational reach. Gradually, P-47s began flying deeper escort missions, protecting bombers farther east before turning home. And as those missions multiplied, German pilots were forced to reckon with a machine they had dismissed as a joke. For Luftwaffe fighter groups stationed in France and Belgium, the P-47's arrival in numbers was an unwelcome surprise. They found that the Jug could now hold altitude with them during combat climbs. The FW-190A, once dominant above 20,000 feet, began to lose its edge as the Thunderbolt's turbocharger maintained full power even in the thin air. The German pilots were trained to fight with sharp turns and vertical reversals, but against the heavy American fighter, those tactics often failed. The P-47 could dive like a stone, reaching over 500 meters in steep descents without structural failure, and then pull into a zoom climb, regaining altitude faster than expected. The Luftwaffe quickly realized this American fighter was no longer the easy target it once was. In England, combat reports confirmed the shift. Pilots from the 56th Fighter Group, the famed Zemke's Wolf Pack, reported that their modified P-47s could now fight on equal terms with the enemy. Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke himself insisted that altitude discipline and speed were the keys to survival in a Thunderbolt. He trained his pilots to avoid slow-turning fights, instead using dive and zoom tactics to exploit the aircraft's tremendous momentum. Once they understood the machine's rhythm, the results were devastating. German fighters that tried to follow a P-47 through a dive often broke apart or lost control from compressibility. Those that attempted to climb after it found themselves hanging helplessly below as the Thunderbolt powered upward into another attack. By early 1944, the transformation was complete. The flying brick had become the high-altitude hammer of the 8th Air Force. Its bulky frame now made sense. Every curve, every rivet served a purpose. The turbocharger buried in its belly gave it lungs that no German piston engine could match. Its thick skin and armor allowed pilots to return from missions that would have shredded lighter fighters. Its 8 50 caliber machine guns tore through enemy aircraft and ground targets alike. What had once been a source of ridicule became a symbol of brute reliability and American industrial might. But reputation, in war, changes slowly. Even as Thunderbolts began to dominate in the upper air, stories of their early failures lingered. Pilots who hadn't flown the improved versions still mocked the plane's bulk. Yet for those who had seen what it could do, who had climbed through German contrails and come out alive, the truth was undeniable. The P-47 was no longer a joke. It was an apex predator in the thin, cold air where wars were decided. And as 1944 dawned, those skies above Europe were about to become a proving ground, not just for machines, but for the men who flew them. The Luftwaffe's confidence would be tested, the Allies' strategy reshaped, and the legend of the Thunderbolt sealed in the crucible of high-altitude combat. Every machine of war reveals its nature through the men who fight with it, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was no exception. By late 1943, the aircraft had become a paradox. A heavy brute that could climb like a champion, a flying brick that could dance in the thin air of Europe's upper skies. To understand how that transformation echoed through the war, one must see the Thunderbolt from several angles: the human, the technological, and the tactical, each one shaping its destiny and reputation. The Thunderbolt's story was inseparable from the people who flew and maintained it. At first, many pilots despised it. They had trained in light, elegant aircraft such as the P-40 or the Spitfire, and the P-47 felt like a monster by comparison. Taxiing it along English airfields was a struggle. Visibility over its massive nose was terrible, and the weight made takeoffs long and nerve-wracking. Yet over time, that same bulk began to inspire a different feeling: trust. A P-47 could take hits, heavy hits, and still bring its pilot home. Crews soon realized that the Jug was more than a fighter. It was a flying fortress for one man. Ground crews loved it too, though at first they cursed its complex turbocharger and wiring. They spent long nights in the freezing rain of East Anglia, wrenching on its vast fuselage and tuning the delicate balance between engine and turbine. Every time one came back riddled with holes yet still running, their pride grew. Pilots who once laughed at its bulk began to write home about it with affection. It became, in their words, a friend. Captain Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group survived being attacked by a swarm of FW-190s. His canopy jammed, his engine damaged, his controls shredded. And still the Thunderbolt refused to die. He limped back to base, leaking oil and fuel, a living testament to its durability. For men who faced death daily, that kind of loyalty from a machine-bred devotion. The Thunderbolt's technology was both its curse and its salvation. The heart of its power lay in the enormous Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp engine. But its real genius was the turbo-supercharger system hidden deep in its fuselage. Most fighters used simple mechanical superchargers to force air into their engines, but the P-47's system used exhaust gases to spin a turbine, compressing air at altitude and maintaining sea-level power above 25,000 feet. It was an engineering marvel for its time, an elegant solution wrapped inside an inelegant frame. The price was complexity. Long ducts, heavy piping, and the need for meticulous maintenance. But the payoff was immense. At altitudes where German engines gasped for air, the Thunderbolt's engine still roared with full power. This system gave the aircraft its defining advantage, the ability to climb and fight effectively in the stratosphere. While the Bf-109 and FW-190 saw performance drop sharply above 20,000 feet, the P-47 seemed to grow stronger the higher it went. It could dive faster, recover from those dives safely, and use its energy to regain altitude in a zoom climb unmatched by most piston fighters of the era. The Thunderbolt was, in truth, a turbocharged fist punching through the sky, its bulk hiding a remarkable piece of aeronautical innovation. Tactically, the P-47 demanded a different mindset. Pilots who tried to dogfight in tight turns were quickly punished. The German fighters could outroll and outturn them with ease. But those who mastered energy fighting, speed, altitude, and momentum became nearly untouchable. The Thunderbolt was built for the boom and zoom. It could dive at frightening speeds, unleash 8 50-caliber machine guns in a single blistering pass, and then climb away before the enemy could respond. At full throttle, it could outdive any fighter in the sky. Experienced commanders like Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke drilled this philosophy into his men. He taught them never to fight the German way. Instead, they were to attack from above, use speed as a weapon, and always climb back into the thin blue safety of altitude. In his view, the Thunderbolt was not a duelist. It was a hammer. When used correctly, it struck once, hard, and disappeared into the sun. Zemke's doctrine changed the way American fighter groups fought. Engagements that had once favored the Luftwaffe began to shift toward the Americans. In the words of one German pilot captured in 1944, "The Thunderbolt is too fast to follow in the dive and too strong to kill quickly." That statement summed up the shifting reality of air combat over Europe. German fighters that once dove with impunity now faced an adversary that could match or exceed their performance at high altitude. Allied pilots, armed with new confidence and tactics suited to their machine, began to turn the tide. By the winter of 1943, the transformation was visible across the airfields of southern England. The once mocked Jug now stood proudly beside the sleek Mustangs and Lightnings, its fuselage scarred but reliable. Its crews no longer apologized for its shape. They celebrated it. The Thunderbolt had earned its place not by beauty or grace, but by endurance and power. It had become the embodiment of the industrial strength and resilience that defined the American war effort. But there were still more sides to the story, angles that revealed how this machine affected not only tactics and technology, but also its enemies, its commanders, and the moral weight of its immense destructive power. To the Luftwaffe, the Thunderbolt was at first an amusing sight, a massive, round-bodied intruder that looked more like a bomber than a fighter. When German pilots first encountered it in early 1943, they dismissed it as an easy kill. Reports referred to it mockingly as der dicke Amerikaner, the fat American, and die fliegende Milchflasche, the flying milk bottle. The FW-190s, nimble and deadly, routinely cut through early Thunderbolt formations that were still learning how to fight. But as months passed, the laughter began to fade. By late 1943, German reconnaissance noted new propeller shapes and performance changes. P-47s were climbing faster, higher, and appearing in places they hadn't before. Luftwaffe intelligence officers began to warn their pilots, "Do not climb with the Thunderbolt, it will follow you to altitude." By 1944, the Thunderbolt's new capabilities were undeniable. German pilots found themselves outpaced in vertical maneuvers at high altitude. They discovered that even when a P-47 was hit, it didn't die easily. Many Luftwaffe veterans later recalled frustration, shooting at a Thunderbolt only to watch it soak up cannon fire, roll over and dive away, trailing smoke, still flying. The heavy armor and radial engine, less vulnerable than the liquid-cooled designs of German fighters, gave American pilots survival odds that bordered on astonishing. As air superiority slipped away, German flyers began to view the Thunderbolt not as a clumsy machine, but as a relentless opponent. It wasn't beautiful or elegant, but it was unstoppable. The transformation of the P-47 from a misunderstood brute into a decisive weapon owed as much to leadership as to engineering. Within the 8th Fighter Command, figures like General William Kepner and Colonel Hubert Zemke saw the aircraft's potential early. They understood that technology alone doesn't win wars. It must be paired with doctrine. Zemke, a strategist as much as a fighter pilot, recognized that the Thunderbolt's true strength was its ability to control altitude and energy. He rewrote combat manuals, drilled his squadrons relentlessly, and emphasized teamwork over individual dogfighting heroics. Under his command, the 56th Fighter Group became one of the most successful in the European theater, producing aces like Francis Gabby Gabreski and Robert S. Johnson. These leaders instilled discipline. Pilots learned to fight smart, strike once, climb out, and stay alive to fight another day. Their results spoke louder than any rumor. Kill ratios began to tilt in favor of the Americans. Mission reports recorded engagements where P-47 formations shot down large numbers of German fighters while suffering minimal losses. The Thunderbolt, once seen as the underdog, became the weapon of organized, methodical air dominance. It wasn't flair that won these battles. It was leadership that knew how to match human tactics to machine physics. As the war ground on, the Thunderbolt's identity evolved yet again. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, and the P-47's role expanded from escorting bombers to striking ground targets across occupied Europe. Its immense weight, once criticized, now became an advantage. It could carry a full complement of bombs, rockets, and fuel without compromising its handling. P-47s began destroying locomotives, supply columns, bridges, and armored convoys with ruthless efficiency. The same aircraft once mocked as too big for combat became a thunderous symbol of destruction, raining fire on German infrastructure in preparation for the D-Day invasion. Yet, within this success lay a moral complexity. Many pilots who transitioned from air-to-air combat to ground attack confessed a different kind of burden. The dogfights were personal, pilot against pilot, skill against skill. But strafing columns of trucks, trains, and soldiers on retreating roads felt less like battle and more like slaughter. The war demanded it, but it left marks on the men who carried it out. Some spoke of the eerie sight of the battlefield from above, the flashes of explosions against fields and villages, the smoke curling upward as they flew home through a quiet sunset. The P-47 had become one of the most effective ground attack aircraft of the war, but with that came a haunting realization. Overwhelming power changes not only the enemy, but those who wield it. Still, in strategic terms, the moral ambiguity did not alter the outcome. The Thunderbolt's ability to suppress enemy movement across France and Germany after D-Day crippled the Wehrmacht's logistics. It destroyed thousands of vehicles and locomotives, isolating frontline divisions from supply lines. In this role, the Jug was unmatched. When the Luftwaffe could no longer rise to meet it, the P-47 ruled the skies with impunity. By the end of 1944, German pilots who once mocked the aircraft had learned to fear it. Allied commanders who once doubted it now depended on it. And the American public, seeing photographs of P-47s lined on European airfields, came to understand that power and resilience sometimes outweighed beauty and grace. The Thunderbolt's evolution, from a misunderstood giant to the muscle of Allied air power, was nearly complete. But its greatest test still lay ahead, proving its worth in combat's most decisive moments, where altitude, courage, and machine would meet in a single flash of history. It was February 20th, 1944, one of the coldest mornings of the European air war. Dawn crept slowly over the English countryside, lighting up rows of silver fighters lined along muddy runways. Ground crews moved in silence, their breath clouding in the frost as they loaded ammunition belts and checked fuel lines. In the distance, the heavy drone of B-17 bombers rolled like thunder across the horizon. This was the beginning of Operation Argument, better known to history as Big Week, a massive Allied air offensive designed to cripple the German aircraft industry and lure the Luftwaffe into open combat. It would be the week that defined the Thunderbolt's reputation. By R-900 hours, formations of B-17s and B-24s were streaming toward central Germany, their contrails stretching for miles. Above and ahead of them flew squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts, escorts on a mission deep into enemy airspace. For many of these pilots, it was their first taste of extended-range operations, made possible by the addition of drop tanks and the newly upgraded engines with water injection. Among them was the 56th Fighter Group under Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, whose pilots had drilled for months for this moment. Their orders were clear: protect the bombers at all costs, engage the Luftwaffe when it appeared, and demonstrate that the days of German dominance were over. The first contacts came shortly after crossing the Dutch border. Radar reports lit up with climbing blips, FW-190s and Bf-109s scrambling to intercept the bomber streams. German pilots were confident. They had fought these raids for months, and they believed their altitude advantage would once again give them the upper hand. But as they clawed upward into the cold air, they were met not by fragile American bombers, but by climbing Thunderbolts already above them. Zemke's formations, flying at 25,000 feet, used their turbo superchargers to full effect, maintaining engine power where German aircraft began to falter. The Luftwaffe's climb rate dropped sharply above that altitude. The P-47s did not. At 27,000 feet near Brunswick, the first engagements erupted. Zemke's Wolf Pack spotted a swarm of FW-190As forming to attack a bomber formation from below. He ordered a diving assault from the sun. The Thunderbolts roared down at over 400 MAP, their 850 caliber guns flashing in unison. The German formation broke instantly, half diving to escape, the other half rolling to climb. One FW-190 tried to loop upward into a counterattack, but the P-47 behind it simply kept climbing. In a maneuver that stunned the Luftwaffe pilots, the heavy American fighter outclimbed its pursuer, flipped over, and dove back down with guns blazing. Within minutes, the sky became a whirlwind of contrails, flashes, and black smoke. Zemke's pilots used energy fighting exactly as trained: strike fast, pull up, and use altitude as armor. Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, one of the group's leading aces, described seeing German fighters stall out below him as they tried to follow his climb. "They couldn't stay with us anymore," he wrote later. "The Thunderbolt just kept going." In that thin, frigid air, the mockery that once followed the flying brick was gone. The P-47 was now the apex predator of altitude combat. Meanwhile, across the sector, the 78th Fighter Group joined the melee. Their Thunderbolts dove through German formations attacking the bomber streams near Gotha. In one recorded encounter, a pair of P-47s climbed through the vapor trails to engage 3 Bf-109Gs head-on. The German fighters tried to roll out and dive, but the Thunderbolts' immense momentum carried them upward, then down again in a deadly arc. 2 109s were shredded in seconds. The third broke away, streaming fuel, spiraling into the haze. Pilots on both sides later remarked that this engagement was different from earlier months. The Thunderbolts were no longer slow or clumsy. They were fast, brutal, and seemingly tireless. For the Luftwaffe, the shock was immediate. Their long-held assumption that no American fighter could sustain climb performance at altitude was shattered. Reports filed after the mission described new propeller-equipped Thunderbolts with remarkable vertical acceleration. The German pilots realized that their window of superiority was closing. What followed in the coming days confirmed it. The Luftwaffe was forced to rise en masse to defend factories, only to lose veteran pilots faster than they could replace them. As the sun set over the frozen fields of Germany, the surviving Thunderbolts turned for home. Their fuselages were riddled with bullet holes, but most were still flying. The bombers behind them had suffered losses, yes, but far fewer than in previous months. The new tactics, new hardware, and new resolve had worked. That week alone, the Luftwaffe lost hundreds of aircraft, many in battles where the P-47 dominated the upper air. By the time Zemke landed back at Halesworth, the field was alive with the sound of engines cooling and men shouting over the roar. Mechanics ran to count the returning aircraft. Pilots climbed out pale and exhausted, their gloved hands still trembling from hours of combat. They had just fought and won one of the largest aerial battles of the war, and in doing so, they had rewritten the Thunderbolt story forever. The flying brick had outclimbed its enemies, but its proving ground was not over yet. The next mission would test not just its power, but its endurance, in the face of a Luftwaffe desperate to strike back. 2 days after that first great clash of Big Week, the sky over Germany burned again. February 22, 1944, thick cloud over the Rhineland, sunlight flashing through gaps like fire through smoke. The air was alive with radio calls, tracer fire, and desperation. The Luftwaffe was throwing everything it had into the fight. Across hundreds of miles of sky, P-47s, P-38s, and newly arrived P-51 Mustangs tangled with swarms of German interceptors rising from airfields at Kassel, Hanover, and Leipzig. It was a battle not for territory, but for the very control of the air itself. Among the Thunderbolts that morning were men who had already survived the earlier engagements. Their confidence was tempered now by exhaustion, but their understanding of the machine they flew was absolute. The 56th Fighter Group again climbed ahead of the bomber streams, engines roaring as turbochargers whined. Zemke's wolf pack split into cover elements, each squadron taking a block of altitude to guard. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin, but the P-47's turbo system sang a mechanical heartbeat that never faltered. German formations appeared below, climbing fast, and the wolf pack dropped to meet them head-on. The engagement that followed near Leipzig would later be studied by air tacticians for decades. The Luftwaffe's the 3 JG-11 Squadron, experienced, disciplined, flying the agile FW-190A6, attacked from a climbing angle, expecting the heavy Thunderbolts to break or dive away. Instead, the Americans rolled into a shallow dive to build speed, then pulled into a steep climb that stunned their opponents. The Germans found themselves nose up, losing energy fast, while the Thunderbolts, now equipped with paddle blade props and water injection, roared past them in a near vertical ascent. One German pilot later admitted in interrogation that he could not believe the big American could climb like that. In seconds, the hunters became the hunted. From the bombers above, gunners watched in disbelief as silver streaks, P-47s curved upward through twisting trails of smoke, flipping over at the top to dive back down with streams of 50 caliber fire. Each pass shredded a German fighter before the Thunderbolt pulled away again. It was not a duel, it was an execution. The Luftwaffe's disciplined formations disintegrated under the shock of the assault. The very airspace that had once belonged to them now belonged to the Americans. For the pilots inside those Thunderbolts, the experience was both terrifying and exhilarating. The cockpit rattled violently during high-speed dives, the airframe shuddering under the force of compressibility. Many pilots later recalled feeling as though the aircraft itself was alive, groaning, creaking, yet refusing to break. At those speeds, every movement was a calculation between survival and death. Some P-47s plunged past 500 miles per hour, close to the edge of structural limits, before pulling into their massive zoom climbs. Yet time and again the plane held together. It had earned its name Thunderbolt, not as a boast, but as a literal description of what it felt like when it struck. The results of those February battles were staggering. In just 6 days of Operation Argument, the Luftwaffe lost over 600 fighters, many of them veteran pilots. German aircraft production would continue for months, but the experienced men to fly them were gone. The Allies had won the Battle of Altitude. For the first time in the war, the U.S. 8th Air Force could launch bombing raids deep into Germany under reliable escort. The sky that had once belonged to the Jagdwaffe was now contested, and soon it would be dominated. When the surviving pilots returned to their English bases after those missions, The transformation was palpable. The same airfields that once rang with frustration now buzzed with triumph. Pilots who had cursed the Thunderbolt's weight now slapped its armor with affection. Mechanics who had dreaded maintaining its complex systems now spoke with pride of the engines that had carried their men home. The flying brick had climbed higher than anyone thought possible, literally and symbolically. For the Luftwaffe, the shock was deeper than mere loss. Big Week had forced them to confront the grim reality that their technological advantage was gone. Even with the introduction of new models like the FW-190D and BF-109G6, they could not sustain combat against waves of well-flown, mechanically superior American fighters. The Thunderbolt had changed the physics of the air war. No longer was altitude a German privilege. It was now the American weapon of choice. As the last P-47s of the day returned to England, their engines ticking in the evening chill, the men of Zemke's wolf pack watched the sunset fade over the North Sea. They had seen their friends fall, their fuel nearly run dry and their guns empty. But they had also seen something else. The moment the balance of the air war shifted for good. From that week onward, the Luftwaffe would never again challenge the Allies with the same confidence. The skies that had once echoed with German triumph now thundered with the roar of American engines. The Jug, once mocked and misunderstood, had earned its redemption in the crucible of combat. But victory was never final in war. Ahead lay new missions, low-level strikes, escort runs deep into Germany, and the relentless destruction of the Reich's war machine. The Thunderbolt had proven itself in the vertical battles of Big Week. Now it would prove its worth on the ground below. By the spring of 1944, the sky over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The weeks that followed Big Week marked a quiet but irreversible turning point in the air war. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, once derided as clumsy and overweight, had become a cornerstone of Allied air power. Its dominance was no longer confined to altitude. It now extended across roles, missions, and even branches of service. Everywhere it flew, it carried the same message: the age of the German fighter elite was ending. For the men of the 8th Fighter Command, the change was measurable in survival. Before the Thunderbolt's upgrades, daylight bombing missions were often death sentences for bomber crews. German interceptors would wait until the American escorts turned back for lack of fuel, then descend like hawks upon the helpless B-17s and B-24s. But after February 1944, that pattern was broken. The new drop tanks gave Thunderbolts the reach to accompany bombers deep into enemy territory, and their superior performance meant they could challenge the Luftwaffe at any altitude. For the first time, the bomber streams reached their targets with consistent escort protection. Losses fell dramatically, and morale within the air groups soared. The statistical contrast was stark. In early 1943, bomber losses on deep penetration raids could exceed 20%. By the summer of 1944, that figure had dropped to less than 5% on comparable missions. The Luftwaffe's inability to control altitude meant that intercepting bomber formations became increasingly suicidal. Veteran German pilots were dying faster than replacements could be trained, while the Americans rotated home experienced flyers to train the next wave. The balance of skill and experience had completely reversed, but the Thunderbolt's impact went beyond the skies. As the Allied invasion of Normandy approached, planners looked for an aircraft that could dive bomb, strafe, and survive the deadly wall of flak that awaited any low-level attacker. The answer was obvious. With its thick armor and powerful radial engine, the P-47 could absorb punishment that would tear apart lighter planes. Squadrons were retrained for ground attack roles, and soon, the once mocked fighter became the Allies' most feared close air support weapon. In May 1944, as bomber escorts gave way to low-level strike operations, Thunderbolt pilots learned to fly treetop low, scouring the French countryside for locomotives, trucks, and troop convoys. Armed with bombs, rockets, and its trademark 850 caliber machine guns, the P-47 was capable of obliterating entire columns of vehicles in minutes. Pilots recalled seeing their bullets tear through freight trains, causing boilers to explode and rails to twist under the heat. Others described attacking fuel depots and watching fireballs rise thousands of feet into the air. The very features that had made the Thunderbolt seem cumbersome, its size, weight, and engine power, were now the keys to its success. German ground troops learned to fear the distant growl of its engine, a deep, distinct sound that rumbled through the air long before the aircraft appeared. In captured letters and diaries, Wehrmacht soldiers wrote about the silver monsters that prowled the skies during daylight, striking with terrifying precision. "When the jugs come," one German infantryman wrote, "we hide under anything we can find." The results were devastating. Between D-Day and the liberation of Paris, Thunderbolts destroyed thousands of locomotives, vehicles, and tanks, choking the German army's ability to move reinforcements and supplies. Bridges were shattered, convoys scattered, and rail networks rendered useless. Where once the Luftwaffe had hunted American bombers with impunity, now it was the Germans who hid during the day. By mid-1944, the P-47 had evolved from a misunderstood interceptor into a symbol of Allied air supremacy. It was no longer simply a fighter, it was a force multiplier. It escorted bombers by morning, struck rail lines by afternoon, and returned to its field shot full of holes, still capable of flying again the next day. Its massive radial engine, armored cockpit, and redundant systems gave it an unmatched ability to bring pilots home. Across dozens of bases in England and France, the sight of a battered Thunderbolt rolling safely to a halt became a symbol of reliability that men trusted with their lives. Yet victory had come at a cost. The endless missions took their toll on pilots and machines alike. Thunderbolt squadrons suffered losses to flak and mechanical failure, and the demands of constant sortie schedules strained both manpower and morale. But the pilots knew what their work meant. Each mission they flew tightened the noose around Germany's war machine. Each destroyed train, each strafed column brought the end closer. The Luftwaffe, once proud and confident, was now fighting for survival. Its pilots, veterans of the early Blitzkrieg, found themselves on the defensive, outnumbered, and increasingly outmatched. The Thunderbolt had not just climbed past them in altitude, it had risen above them in power, reliability, and endurance. The war in the air was nearly won. But the true measure of that victory would be written not in statistics or headlines, but in the silence left behind when the skies once filled with battle finally grew quiet again. By the final year of the war, the P-47 Thunderbolt had become more than a machine. It was a legend forged in aluminum and fire. Its transformation from a misunderstood giant into the backbone of Allied air power was complete. Across Europe, from Normandy's beaches to the forests of Germany, its unmistakable shape filled the skies. The Luftwaffe, once the master of altitude and speed, was now a hunted force, its airfields bombed, its pilots exhausted, and its fuel supplies nearly gone. The flying brick had not only survived the mockery, it had outlasted the very aircraft that had mocked it. As Allied forces advanced eastward after D-Day, Thunderbolt squadrons followed closely behind. They operated from hastily built airstrips carved into French fields, often just days after those same locations had been under German control. The P-47's rugged landing gear and powerful engine made it ideal for these rough conditions. It could take off from muddy grass, deliver its payload, and return through smoke and shrapnel. Many pilots described the P-47 as feeling more like a partner than a machine, reliable, loyal, and unbreakable. It was, in their words, a soldier's airplane. The numbers told their own story. By war's end, P-47s had flown over 746,000 combat sorties, more than any other U.S. fighter. They destroyed over 7,000 enemy aircraft, 9,000 locomotives, and 86,000 railway cars. On the ground, they annihilated tens of thousands of vehicles, tanks, and artillery positions. Few machines in history combined so much destructive power with such resilience. In the closing months of 1944, entire German divisions found their supply routes cut to pieces by Thunderbolt raids. The Luftwaffe's own reports began to describe daylight movement as impossible without unacceptable losses. For German pilots, the psychological blow was immense. Once they had hunted the skies with confidence, Now they watched as their squadrons disintegrated under relentless pressure. The Thunderbolt's climb, once mocked as sluggish, had become its symbol of dominance. Luftwaffe veterans later admitted that by 1944, the Thunderbolt was as feared as the Mustang. Its presence over the battlefield was enough to break morale. Even the dreaded flak gunners on the ground, who claimed many P-47s, feared its return, knowing that for every Thunderbolt that fell, dozens more would arrive the next day. Among Allied pilots, the sense of confidence bordered on reverence. Stories circulated through the airfields about aircraft returning with missing cylinders, shredded tails, or wings full of holes. Pilots who flew the P-47 in both Europe and the Pacific swore by its ability to endure. "You could fly it home on faith alone," one recalled. The aircraft's survivability became a silent contract between man and machine, an understanding that, whatever happened in the air, the Jug would fight to bring its pilot back alive. Even after victory was assured, the Thunderbolt continued to serve with distinction. It flew in Italy, the Balkans, and Burma, strafing retreating Axis convoys and pounding entrenched positions. When Germany finally collapsed in May 1945, Thunderbolts roared over the ruins of cities they had once fought to reach. For many of the men who flew them, the sight of the same machine that had been mocked at its birth now circling triumphantly over a defeated Reich carried a deep emotional weight. The aircraft had been misunderstood, underestimated, and ridiculed, but it had never failed its purpose. After the war, as jet technology advanced and new fighters took center stage, the Thunderbolt quietly began to fade from headlines. Yet among those who had served, its reputation only grew. It was remembered not for elegance, but for endurance, not for speed, but for survival. In museums, its broad wings and barrel chest became symbols of an era when strength and simplicity triumphed over refinement. In memoirs, pilots wrote of it with affection, unmatched by any other wartime aircraft. The Thunderbolt, they said, was ugly, loud, and stubborn, and that was exactly why they loved it. By the time peace returned to Europe, the mockery had long since fallen silent. The flying brick had outclimbed not just its enemies, but its own reputation. It had proven that true strength lies not in beauty or grace, but in the relentless will to rise higher, no matter the odds. The air war was over. The sky was quiet again. But the legend of the Thunderbolt, forged in fire and ridicule, would never stop climbing. When the last guns of Europe fell silent in 1945, the skies that had once roared with the fury of combat became still again. The contrails faded, the engines cooled, and the men who had lived their lives at 25,000 feet returned to the ground as changed men. Among them were the pilots of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, men who had seen their ungainly machine evolve from a laughingstock into one of the most respected fighters of the Second World War. Its shape had never been beautiful, but in its purpose and performance, there was something far greater than beauty. There was truth. The Thunderbolt story was not only about engineering, it was about belief. It proved that courage, discipline, and understanding could transform even the most unlikely design into a masterpiece of war. It was not sleek like the Spitfire or elegant like the Mustang, yet it embodied a different kind of excellence, one defined by durability, reliability, and sheer willpower. In the hands of determined pilots, it became a symbol of endurance, a guardian of bombers, and later, a scourge of enemy armor. Its thunderous engine and heavy wings spoke of the industrial might that turned the tide of the air war, but its spirit belonged to the men who refused to give up on it when others mocked it. In many ways, the Thunderbolt mirrored the story of the Allied war effort itself, doubted at first, tested by fire, and finally unstoppable. It represented the power of adaptation, of turning flaws into strengths, and of learning under the unforgiving pressure of combat. Every rivet and scar on its fuselage told the story of innovation born out of necessity, of lessons written in smoke and flame across the skies of Europe. Even decades later, when jets replaced propellers and war moved faster than sound, veterans still remembered the feel of that massive engine rumbling beneath them, the reassurance that no matter how fierce the fight, their Thunderbolt would hold together. The flying brick had become a monument to the idea that in war, As in life, the measure of greatness is not appearance or speed, but resilience. The P-47 Thunderbolt may have begun as an object of ridicule, but it ended as a legend of respect. And as history looks back on that era of fire and steel, its legacy remains clear. Sometimes, the machine that everyone laughs at is the one that ends up saving the world.